What's up, everybody? We are here in our studio with our friend Brandy, already known as Quilts Are on Fire. Thank you so much for being here. Brandy is an official quilt judge. What's your official title, your acronym?
I'm an NACQJ certified judge, and that stands for National Association of Certified Quilt Judges.
She's the real deal, guys, and we have a quilt right here that we're gonna have you judge. Now, I have not shown her this quilt up to now. Like, it's been folded up sitting just like this. So you're gonna get the first peek here on camera. And before we get into it, tell me like the process behind what it takes to become a judge, as well as what are the things you're looking for. I mean, you're gonna do that in detail, but give me like the overview.
Yeah, well, as a textile artist, I always kind of felt left out in the quilting world. So I wanted to educate myself. So that's why I decided to become a judge. And the process took me about 5 years, and it's a really good program in the USA. And I decided to take this because there's a lot of myths out there about judging. So I want to start off with one myth first of all, because you know, a lot of people think that judges are going to come and be all critical of your quilt, and judging is the actual word. That's what we're called. We're called a judge. I kind of wish we were called...
It's kind of like a negative word, right?
I kind of wish we were called educators or, you know...
enthusiasts.
Yeah, we could inspire people to grow. But anyway, the fact that is that we don't even actually use these kind of tools. I don't come in with, you know, I'm not criticizing your quilt looking off for all these crazy things. I'm actually just comparing quilts in the category to the other quilts in the category. And that really is all we do. So when we're judging, we actually do not have the gloves. Gloves are for people in a quilt show who do not want to touch the quilts in a quilt show. We don't use these. We clean our hands, we judge the quilts, and really it's all about the education.
Very cool. Okay, so let's get into it then. So let's say we have this quilt and we have 3 other quilts that are competing for Best of Show.
Yeah.
You're judging those quilts against each other. Mm-hmm. You're not judging them against what Jacqueline DeJong made. No. Correct? You're only doing against whatever's in that show.
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever's in the category is compared to what's in that category. And then for Best of Show, I mean, that's the big award. So we may be comparing the top quilts in different categories for Best of Show. Really, we're looking at 3 major things. So every quilt judge has a little order of judging in their mind, and they kind of have it memorized, and it's usually pretty similar across the board. So we start off with general appearance. When we first see a quilt for the first time, we're looking for things like, is it even ready for the show? Does it smell horrible like cigarette smoke?
Sure.
Does it have pet hair all over it? Is it soiled with stains? Yeah. Those are the ones that are going to be sort of...
Your obvious, like,
they're going to be set aside right away. Yeah, they're going to be set aside right away. They're not going to be in the top 3, so we will move them aside. We'll still give constructive criticism. We'll talk about, be sure to prepare your judge for show readiness.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, general appearance, so show readiness. The next thing under general appearance is visual impact. So
like the wow factor.
Yeah,
right?
So you know, something that we might see right away is like, oh, they put so much work into this quilt, but it is all the same color value, and it just looks like one big piece of fabric. So that you know, that could be of detriment.
Unless they're going for the whole cloth look.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it's a whole cloth quilt, we're really going to be diving into the quilting and that design. So that was the first thing we're looking at, general appearance. When we move on to the second thing that we're looking at, it really is the design elements. So we're taking a look at the composition of the quilt, the layout of the quilt, and the balance of the things that are in the quilt. Do you get lost in it because it's so busy and you know your mind can't settle anywhere on a focal point, or is your eye drawn around the quilt at seeing all these delightful things that the quilter has done? And it's not really like is it too much of this or too much of that, it's does it work and was it purposeful, you know, that kind of thing. So you know, we're not here to say what were they thinking, we're here to say does it work?
Thank goodness, right?
Does this work? And of course, does it work compared to the other quilts in that category? A lot of people think that a judge is coming on in and they're judging a quilter. We don't even know who the quilters are. We literally don't know. And so we are judging the quilts compared to the other quilts in that category. The whole point of judging is you want to give the quilter, what did they do well, what could they improve on for the integrity of the quilt. We're not going to say, oh, you shouldn't have used that color. We're going to say, you know, perhaps this quilt could benefit from a little more quilting, the density, something like that, because we want the integrity of the quilt to last forever. So there's one more thing I want to talk about, because we did general appearance, we did design elements. We want to get into the workmanship. A lot of people think, oh, all they care about is the binding. All the judges care about is the binding. That's something we hear so much. But
that's interesting. I've never heard that. Interesting.
Well, judges leave a lot of comments about the binding because the binding is such an integral part of the quilt. If a quilt is going to wear out over 20, 30, 40 years, the first thing to go is going to be that binding. And so we want the binding to be full, secure, well stitched, and not empty or not bursting. You know, so there's
how does that look on first feel?
This
binding.
Feels just like it's a touch empty, and we can talk about that
great.
a little bit more. Oh no, it had a
Never mind, we're not doing this. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so we talk about those three things: general appearance, design elements, and workmanship.
Okay.
And then from there, we're going to be placing quilts in the category. So we're going to be deciding, probably going to decide if they're about the top 6 of the category. So as we're judging, we release quilts to category, meaning we release them to go get hung because they're not in the top 6. We bring it down to the top 5 or 6 because then we have to choose the top.
You're rounding it down to, hey, like we really like these 5 quilts.
Yeah. Once we go there, then we go out of those first 3 things we talked about already, and we go into the awards. And what we're looking at when we're choosing the awards, you know, is there one that's a clear winner already? Like we can just decide, is there one that we can let go of because it just doesn't compare, but it happened to make the top 3?
Okay.
But we're looking at degree of difficulty now and complexity of design.
Okay.
So you might have a couple of quilts in a category. They're great under general appearance. They're great under design elements. They're great under workmanship. But how many elements are working together? How complex is this quilt?
So how does that work with? So like this obviously is a manufactured pattern. It's one that lots of people have made. That being the case, if this was being compared against an original design that was similar, that would give that the leg up.
Well, we don't know. We don't generally know as a judge whether it's an original design or a pattern.
Okay.
So it depends on the show you're in. If you are at a smaller local show, you might see the quilt 3 times in the show and know, okay, well this is, but we're not going
Famous
to assume,
quilts.
as a judge, we want to work really hard to not make any assumptions, right? So let me give you an example about when we would never want to make any assumptions. So let's say we're looking at a quilt and it looks like it could be an all over computerized edge to edge design. Okay? As a quilt judge, you don't want to assume that because that could be just a really, really good domestic free motion quilter who did an amazing job, such an amazing job that it looks like it's edge to edge computerized.
Sure, that makes sense.
So you can't make that judgment. You just have to look at the workmanship and
Interesting. I never
usually
thought of that.
if there's something like that happening, that's not going to be something we're talking about because it's going to be well done. You know, so we might try to find something like, you know, be sure to remove all loose threads. We might make a comment like that if there's things hanging off the quilt.
Should we open this up and get to it?
Let's take it.
A lot of our viewers have seen this quilt. We've hung it behind our film studio before. Right there.
Okay.
I made this yesterday.
Did you? We start with general appearance. So obviously.
Don't look, I gotta pull some threads. All right,
obviously, we're going to be taking a look if there's loose threads, if it smells. Sometimes I will bring it right up to my face.
And actually smell it.
Yeah, I will smell it because you get a waft of, oh, this is from a smoker's home or something like that. So it's.
And I do one of these here. There we go.
I don't come across that very often. It's really rare, really rare. But once in a while, it just you can really tell that this is a quilt that's been used for a decade, and you know. And you don't even always have to mention that. Sometimes there are other things that really would help the educate the quilt or help them grow, and then you won't mention that.
Okay. All right. So smell check.
Yeah. So readiness for show. This quilt looks ready for show. It's finished. There's not anything unfinished. There's no missing, nothing glaringly missing. When I'm looking at the overall view of the quilt, does something jump out at me right away? You know, sometimes you'll see a quilt and there's one block turned and you're thinking, oh no, was that purposeful or was it an accident, that kind of thing. So let's talk about that for a second, because sometimes when you're looking at a quilt, they have a directional fabric and there's a couple. And
it's sideways.
Yeah, there's one sideways and you're thinking, oh, that looks like a mistake. But if you have directional fabric and you have them sideways all over the place, that looks purposeful. But if you have them all meticulously laid out perfectly and then one is crooked or cut off, you're thinking, oops, that was a mistake, or oops, they ran out of fabric or something like that. So
stretched.
Yeah.
You got one of the little wiener dogs that's like this long because it's like we had to get the best out of that one.
Yeah. So you're not going to make a comment about something like that unless you think it really takes away from the overall appeal of the quilt. Okay, so we've got the general appearance, visual impact. Let's talk about visual impact. So this is an absolutely stunning pattern, right? So when we're talking about giving comments for judging, we're not going to say, oh, I love this, or this is lovely, or this is a stunning quilt, or anything. We're not going to say those personal comments comments where it's our own personal preference.
Okay.
We leave.
Loved your color choice.
Yeah,
you wouldn't say that, right?
No, we would say something like the variety of colors, you know, around the quilt work well with the overall star design or something like that.
Okay.
So we would say, you know, this type of use of color works well with the design, and it works throughout the entire quilt.
Okay.
Another great thing about overall design is we could say use of color in the pieced border really allows the center medallion to
showing this here.
Show well. Yeah.
Let's say this was done in variegated thread as far as the quilting goes. You could say something like the variegated thread coordinates well with overall appearance of quilt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Or you could say something like the use of variegated thread in the background is fighting with the center medallion.
Sure.
You know, if it just
makes it too busy, makes it too
because
whatever.
Right now the use of this really holds that black down. It's the background and allows the colorful piecing to just shine, right?
Sure.
So we're moving on from general appearance and visual impact to design elements. We've already talked a little bit about visual impact. Now we're going to go into composition and layout. Like when we're looking at this could be a pattern. I have no idea. But the way that it's laid out with the small stars, the large stars, the different size stars really draws your eye around. And it's got a nice balance as well. And then also all of the colors in the center, like I already mentioned, really shine because of the border. It just draws it all together. So that works really well. Let's talk about the quilting design and density a little bit more. In this type of piecing, when you have a nice dense background in the black or in the white, it really allows this to pop. It's almost like a trapunto effect when you're not even doing trapunto. So it really allows that intricate piecing to shine.
And guys, for anybody who doesn't know what trapunto means, will you explain that real fast? Because that might not be something, a term that everybody knows.
Yeah, trapunto is where you have extra added loft in. So you may have added batting or even stuffing in there. There's a dozen.
Trying to get it to pop.
Yeah, there's a dozen different ways to do trapunto, but it really allows, you know, features of the quilt to pop.
When I'm going to show this here close on camera, you can kind of see what she's saying here. Like, this is obviously matted isn't the right word, but you know, matted down with the thread. You know, it's very, very dense. And then you have right here where you can actually see that it's got a little bit of like puffiness to it, trapunto to it. That makes the difference. So it's adding that trapunto effect for anybody that didn't know what that term meant.
Yeah, so like a comment that I would do is, you know, the dense quilting in the background allows the pieced colors to pop. Something like that. And so a quilter would be like, okay, I did a good job on that. They understand that.
Nailed it. Nailed that category.
And so let's talk a little bit about how much time I have as a judge. Because
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, sometimes we have a show that is massive. Sometimes we have a smaller show.
You have 1,000 quilts you have to judge.
So if we have 1,000 quilts, we might have 2 to 3 minutes per quilt. And that's a couple of days of quilt judging. But if we have a smaller show, my ideal thing is I love to give at least 2 comments on, you know, what worked well with the quilt and 1 constructive criticism. That's my dream as a judge, to be able to have the time to give that much information. You know, sometimes I'm looking at a quilt that is like tops of the category, and I'm like, I can't find anything constructive about this quilt. There's nothing wrong with it that I can actually find. And that's okay. I can give 3 comments instead. I mean, if it's going to win Best in Show anyway, that's okay.
What are you going to say?
Yeah, so it's
just totally find something like, there was a hair, one singular hair on that. Right?
And you have to remember, when you're reading judges' comments, they don't have a whole hour to be deliberating over your quilt. They are literally looking at what pops out the most. How could we help this quilter the most? Let's try to give them 1 tidbit that really is going to work.
Well, and it's not personal. You don't know the person that made this quilt. You don't know what their quilting background is. If this quilt right here was the first quilt someone ever made, you'd never know that. That would add extra bonus points, right? Like, hey, like you did a killer job, whether or not, you know. So
the only time we would know if this is a very early quilt in their quilting path is if they are in the first time entrant, or, you know, sometimes there's a 30-year quilter in the first time entrant because they've been quilting forever and they've just never entered shows. But you really can't assume anything when you're judging. You just have to sort of compare them to each other. So let's move on to technical proficiency. Okay, this is sometimes where it comes down to it when we're moving quilts back to category. Sometimes there's just little things that we find. So this is when we're going to dive in and take a closer look. So when I'm looking at these circles, for instance, I'm thinking, wow, they're all different sizes. They're very consistent. There's nice lines, and they don't generally go over the line. So I'll be looking at that.
Okay. You're looking at it as far as quilting or piecing, or both?
I'm looking at all of it.
All of it. Okay.
Yeah. I'm starting with the quilting just so that we can sort of, look at all these. You can't look at the entire quilt because you don't have time, right? So you're going to look at what did they do best in the feature. You might take a quick glance at them all to see if something stands out. I literally find like maybe one tiny little, is there a spot? There's really no spots where it went over. So that's pretty good. You look at the black as well. How did they change from area to area to area? Is it a nice flow?
Is it abrupt? Yeah.
One thing that really works well is the little outlining. So they've got this 1/4 inch outlining and they're capturing the dense quilting in there, and they've repeated that, so they've got it on the outside here as well. So that really works well.
Back to your quilting myths. I feel like people think that a judge is here like, okay, we got a 1/4 inch here, here. You guys aren't doing it.
I'll give you a few things that really stand out for judges, and this is why we say these kind of comments or constructive criticisms most often. When you're stitching in the ditch, you need to stay in the ditch, because when you pop out of the ditch,
they're gonna see it.
It's really noticeable, you know, and it's obvious you didn't mean to do that. So it's noticeable. And so sometimes, you know, as a judge, I think, oh, they really were trying to stay in the ditch, and they know they're supposed to stay in the ditch. But if it's all over the entire quilt, then they might not really know you're supposed to stay. You know, same thing with applique. A lot of times you want to stay off the applique, but if it's consistent throughout the whole quilt, where they've quilted all over the whole applique, and that's the way they did it, it's fine. You know, it's
You're
not
there to tell them what they want to do with their quilts.
It's not detracting from anything. I would think about the density again, but I would go into the piecing. And now, so this is pointy piecing, right? So this is what I'm going to be looking at, the points. I'm going to be looking at the center points. I'm going to have my hand on this center point, and I'm going to be feeling, is there a big lump there, or do they have it nicely twisted underneath and they're pressing, right? This is pressed extremely well. One thing that stands out is these centers are really good. And so I might be saying that as one of my comments. The centers of the stars are flat and pressed well. That might be a nice comment, right? And then there's other areas where you're thinking, okay, this is floating, which is good. I mean, it's not a bad thing. But when they're supposed to be lined up directly, say a point is supposed to be touching, like these ones.
Yeah, you have 2 points that are supposed to be touching.
You want to be watching whether these points are cut off or floating. So if they're cut off, you know, you can see that they're cut off. If they're floating, they're not touching the line. And you can see that they're nice and consistent throughout, so they're not. These ones are purposefully floating, which makes it easier on the quilter, but it's also very visually appealing to the eye.
I did that on purpose.
Yeah, the complexity would be up a notch if these were all matched up perfectly, but there's nothing to say about that because there's no problem.
That was the purpose,
Yeah, there's no problem with it. Another thing that we find often as judges is we find a lot of shadowing. When you're using white and these bright, vibrant colors, you can find a lot of shadowing. I don't see much of it.
And what do you mean by shadowing?
So shadowing is when you're using colorful fabrics and they're turned, you're looking at the 1/4 inch seam allowance that's underneath the fabric.
Oh, you're talking about shadowing from underneath.
Yeah, if I see blue here or orange here, that would be shadowing.
Interesting,
and then also, you could have shadowing in your applique. So a lot of times people will prevent that by using a little piece of interfacing or another piece of fabric underneath to prevent that shadowing.
But I guess you could also have that as well, where if you have a piece of fabric on top and they have their interfacing too big, you can see the shadowing of the interface behind it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Okay.
So a constructive criticism on that would be work hard to prevent shadowing, or, you know, there's different things you can do to prevent shadowing, but take extra care that shadowing isn't evident.
Are you, in your head, are you giving this like a, okay, piecing, it's a number 8. Quilting, it's a number 10. Are you like giving yourself kind of like a... No, so there's a few ways that you can judge, and different shows do it different ways. And as a judge, I work with the show committee on how they want their show judged. It's up to the show committee. And so sometimes they'll use a numerical system, and sometimes they'll use a comparative system. I personally prefer the comparative system because we're comparing quilts to quilts in the category. When we use a numerical system, it can get difficult because you might have a whole cloth quilt. There isn't a whole cloth quilt category, so it's in a category with other pieced quilts, and then it's really piecing difficulty on a whole cloth quilt.
It's apples to
0, right?
You can't really compare with the number system.
I see.
I'm not actually counting numbers in my head. I'm comparing to other quilts. And you make it easy on yourself as a judge by keeping it for awards or releasing it to category, and when you have your top 6, that's when you really dive into the details.
What's our next step?
We're going to look at the finishing. So I am actually going to look at whether it's square. You can fold it and figure out if it's square or not. If it's a hanging show and you're judging it hanging, you can actually see on the wall if it's hanging square,
if it's warped,
if there's big waves in it or anything like that. Also, you're going to look at the binding. So let's just talk about that binding a little earlier, because you can see this binding is beautifully straight. It's nicely stitched. It's smaller on the front than the back, which is not really a big issue, but it is not quite full. So Brody, if you run your hands, you can see that the batting doesn't reach right to the end fold.
I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you can feel it. You can feel that it has a tiny bit of...
There's a little space in there.
Yeah.
And that just goes to the integrity of the quilt. You want this binding to be full. Okay, and so there's two different problems you can have with the binding. Well, three in fact, that are common for judges to make comment over. Okay. And those are the stitches. You want your stitches to be nice and firm and close together so that it's well stitched. You want it to be full so that it's not loose, because that's the first thing that will wear out. And if it's loose, it'll wear out a little more easily.
Okay.
And then you don't want it to be so full that it's bursting and your like binding almost looks curled over and round. You know, you can have a round, full, bursting binding.
Okay.
That's really hard on the stitches. So, you know, like I said earlier, a lot of people are like, gee, judges are real hard on the binding, but it's such an integral part of the quilt because that's the first thing that wears out over time.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Give me a number on this quilt. If you're gonna grade it, like this is an A quilt, this is an A+ quilt, or a number or a letter, this is a 10. We
don't generally do our number rating on a quilt, but if I was gonna say, if this came out on the table as a quilt judge, I'd be like, oh, we're gonna be looking closely at this one because at first glance it looks quite well done.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be held for category, so it'll be held for.
So this one you would hold to compare to the next.
I would hold this for an award, and it would be compared to the other ones in the category. To end off this whole thing, I think the most important thing that we can give to a quilter is we can give a few comments that tell them exactly what they're doing well and what works in this quilt. So for this quilt, it would be the quilting is amazing, the piecing is amazing, and the color, use of color. So those would be where I'm focusing my comments on, would be the quilting, the piecing, and the use of color. And if I was going to find something constructive about this entire quilt, the only thing that really stands out is the little bit.
Is the binding.
Yeah. Binding. Yeah.
I'll call it an A. I'll call it an A. Thank you for teaching us. And guys, if you're planning on sending your quilting to be judged, follow the simple steps. On the screen you saw kind of the different categories that we are showing or that Brandy has taught us. But follow the steps, do the best you can, and remember, have fun. Brandy or whatever judge is going to be judging your quilt is going to give you some constructive criticism. Take it, use it, but don't feel like, oh man, my binding sucks, right? Yeah. Or whatever it is. So, well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a lot of fun. And guys, send in those quilts to quilt shows, have them judged, have some fun, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.